Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for today's event on resilience. And I tell you, it's lovely to see so many familiar faces and familiar names in the boxes. My ask is, if you're happy to, pop your cameras on. It's always so much nicer speaking to actual people on a screen rather than just black boxes. So for those of you who I have not met before, I am Laura. I'm creative director at Ivy House. And I'm sure lots of you know, because I know lots of you have been to our events before, but at Ivy House, we kind of specialise in two things. So we're experts in leadership development and behavioural change. But increasingly, we're asked to design programmes and solutions to support people with their resilience, which is exactly what we're going to focus on today. So we're going to do that from two angles, from an individual angle and from an organisational perspective. And we actually have an incredible panel of people speaking on that today, and they have had their resilience tested in a whole range of ways. So I'm really excited to let them introduce themselves. But first, I thought I'd just run you through the structure of the day. So first half is going to be me pointing some questions at them so you can find a bit more about them, their incredible stories, what they've learnt. And then we're going to open up for an audience Q&A. So we've actually had a number of questions through from the audience in advance of today. So my glamorous assistant, Bryony, will point those at the right people. And then we will open up for a broader discussion. So if anything pops up, any questions you'd like to ask of our panel, please pop them in the chat as we go through, and we will point them to the right people as we go through. So that's it from me for now. I would love to introduce our amazing speakers. So first of all, Neil, could you let us know who you are and maybe a sentence about yourself?
Lovely. Thanks so much, Laura. And hi, everybody. It's an absolute joy to be here this afternoon. I will just share, I've just come from the greenhouse in the garden, actually. I've sat in the lovely spring sunshine preparing for the event this afternoon, and I hope you've managed to get out in it as well. So my name is Neil Trevina. I am the Director of Delivery here at Ivy House. So I have the privilege of spreading the Ivy House magic across organisations all around the world. But perhaps more relevant today, I spent nearly a decade on the front line of British policing, and I've certainly had my resilience tested from a trauma perspective, being exposed to trauma every single day throughout that 10-year period, pretty much. And so my hope today is that I can share some wisdom, some insight that will really shake up your thinking in relation to individual and organisational resilience. Thanks, Laura.
Thanks so much, Neil. It is a great pleasure to introduce the next speaker. He is my good friend, Andy, and I have to say before he introduces himself, he spoke at a training that we ran recently, and it blew me away. So I'm very excited to have Andy with us. Andy, over to you.
Yeah, hi everybody, I'm Andy. I'm the Head of Operations at Ivy House. I'm excited to tell you my thoughts on resilience, having faced a major life-changing event. Whilst I don't claim to be any sort of expert on resilience, mine has been thoroughly tested, and I hope you'll find something useful from my experience.
Amazing. Thanks, Andy. And I'm sure you've met this lady before. She's incredible. Elka, over to you.
My heart is already going just hearing Andy speak. People don't know the incredible life-changing event he's faced, but it makes my heart pound when he even starts to talk about it. So I'm Elka. I'm the founder of Ivy House. Those of you who've seen me speak before will notice I have a very different background today. And the reason is I'm having my resilience massively tested. My father was rushed into hospital 2 weeks ago. We didn't think he was going to make it through the night. And we're now navigating serious illness with a very disconnected NHS and trying to keep my life going at the same time. So I'm camping in South Wales at the moment in my dad's house. So, yeah.
Thank you, Elka, and thank you so much for joining us. So I'm gonna open up with the probably inevitable first question, which is over to you, Neil. What does resilience mean to you?
Nice, easy one to ease us into today. Thanks, Laura. That's a biggie. It's a big question. So I'm going to share what I believe resilience is all about. Now, the first thing I'd say is, as human beings, we have been resilient for 300,000 years, and it's why we're here today. Those that have been before us have been resilient over the years. They've faced their own difficult times, and they've persevered, and this is why we're here today. I love the quote by Al Seibert, and Al Seibert says that resilience isn't something that we have, it's something that we do. And I love that, because this tees me up beautifully of articulating what I think resilience is all about. The very nature of the word do implies that there's something we do as human beings that sits behind resilience. And for me, it's behavior. And what we know that sits behind your behavior is the way that you think. And we'll explore that a bit more as we go through the session. So to be a bit more succinct, what do I think resilience is? I really believe that resilience is facing and heading towards our goals in life, whatever they be, and they're going to be different for all of us. But it's doing so with three things in mind. The first one is an absolute acceptance that life is imperfect. Perfect does not exist. And actually, what I really do believe is that seeking perfection is the Achilles heel that prevents us from being resilient. So that's the first one. The second one is around courage. Having the courage to act despite fearing something. And that's very different from saying that you are not fearful of something. Fear is part of being human. Courage is having the actual courage to be able to act despite fear. So that's the second thing for me that resilience is about. And the third thing, and this is probably the most important thing, it's having the courage to really know yourself on a very, very deep level. Knowing your mind, knowing your body, and also knowing your soul. What makes you tick? What shapes your perspective on the world? So it's heading towards your goals with all of those things in mind.
That's amazing. Thanks so much, Neil. Andy, how about you? What does it mean to you? Is there anything different for you?
Still fairly similar to what Neil said, but for me, resilience is being able to cope with those bumps in the road that life inevitably throws our way. And it means time and time again, just getting back up when we're knocked down. But I think it's important to remember that those bumps in the road, they shouldn't be viewed as negatives. They're opportunities to learn and grow. And for me personally, many of my greatest opportunities have come from my biggest challenges.
Yeah, so true. Thank you so much, Andy. So Neil, you probably had most of us hooked at your story of being in the police force. So tell us, what's that experience of being in the police taught you about resilience?
So it's a great question, and I'm quite excited to answer this. And actually doing this event has really made me reflect on 10 years of being a police officer. And do you know what I've discovered? I've discovered that actually at the time, I didn't have a clue what was building my resilience at all. But now reflecting back on it, I can absolutely see that there were certain things that were happening to me, how I was showing up, that really helped me build my individual resilience. Let me share those with you. The two key things in relation to that are that policing really taught me there's two types of resilience. There's what I call vulnerable resilience, and there's what I call robust resilience. Let's quickly look at vulnerable resilience. I'm going to share a story with you momentarily around how I was on a path initially to building what I call vulnerable resilience. And it was my first shift as a police officer. Now, excuse me for being morbid slightly to start this conversation, but I'd never seen a dead body in my entire life at the point of joining the police. And I remember arriving in my first early shift. It was 6:30 in the morning. By 7:15 that morning, I went to a fatal accident and I saw my first dead body. By 9:30 that day, I'd gone to another incident and seen my second. And so over the 10 years that I was in the police, I was continually exposed to traumatic events of that nature. And I remember reflecting at the end of my first day and thinking, God, that was a big day. And I remember feeling something inside. I was anxious, I was worried, but I pushed it away because I felt that I had to play a part. I was Neil, I was a cop, I had a uniform, and therefore I had to play a role of being someone who stuff like this just doesn't affect me. Fast forward 2 years later, I remember going to another traumatic incident. And I remember sitting down with my sergeant at the time, who was my supervisor, my leader. And she sat me down and she said to me, Neil, that incident you've just been to, how are you feeling? I said, it was fine. Here we go, repeat behavior. It was fine, I'm okay. And she says, you know what you've just experienced isn't normal. And it's okay to feel the way that you're feeling. And she saw straight through me. She knew that I was struggling and I was playing this part. And that really opened it up for me. And I was able to talk about my genuine feelings in relation to what I had experienced. So what are the key learns for me around that? There's a couple key learns. Firstly, resilience for me was built around being exposed to lots of different things over a period of time. And it was about embracing those experiences. So if you are listening to me talk right now and you're going through a difficult time, don't underestimate how that experience you are having right now will be playing a part in building your overall resilience. It's about embracing those. It's also about practicing skills as well. It's really about practicing skills that perhaps you avoid quite often, such as having difficult conversations, because they're hard. Again, the moment you throw yourself into those things and really embrace them is the moment you start to really build your resilience on specific skills. And then finally, for me, if I were to say that there were 2 silver bullets, if you like, that would all of a sudden make us more resilient, and this is coming from my policing days again, I would say purpose is absolutely critical. For me in the police, knowing that I had to protect people and property, everything I went to made it very easy for me to operate amongst chaos, amongst stress, and when I was exposed to trauma. But also, to go back to my opening piece earlier, I really had to have the courage to really know myself deeply. And that meant having some vulnerable conversations with people. So that's what I would say.
Thanks so much, Nia. I'm a fascinating story, and I'm pausing because I know we've got someone else here who's got an incredible story. Andy, I know you faced some incredible challenges. I would love, if you're happy to, for you to share a bit about them and what they've taught you about resilience.
Well, Laura and Elke, you've sadly picked up my story. Hopefully I can deliver now. So, yeah, from an early age, my passion has always been sport and adventure. And this led me to a career in the RAF in my dream job as aircrew. And believe me, flying around in military aircraft is as cool as it sounds. Unfortunately, my time in the RAF was cut short, and this was due to a climbing accident, which resulted in me falling 20 metres vertically down a cliff. So to put that in perspective, that's the same height as 5 double-decker buses just stacked up on top of each other. I'm still yet to meet anybody who's fallen anywhere near as far as that and survived, so I feel very lucky. However, the fall led to me breaking a shed load of bones in my body, including 4 in my back and 4 in my neck. The breaks in my neck led to a permanent spinal cord injury, which means that I have paralysis for life in all 4 of my limbs. And I also sustained a brain injury, which means I have a number of cognitive challenges, which is why I'm relying quite a lot on my notes today. My resilience was obviously thoroughly tested by the accident, but I've gone on to achieve many things which I couldn't ever have imagined, including winning gold at the Invictus Games, becoming a member of the Great Britain cycling team, and now I'm working towards becoming a GB skier. So becoming disabled and acquiring a brain injury was one of my biggest challenges. And people often talk about bouncing back, but it's not always possible to get back to where you were before. And this is the case with disability. So for me, in this situation, acceptance was like a valuable asset, I guess, in my resilience toolkit. When I was first injured, I had many sort of negative thoughts about all the things that I can no longer do. I consider myself very lucky because I ended up going to the military rehabilitation centre at Headley Court, and I was surrounded by people with similar life-changing injuries. And it was a brilliant environment because we challenged and supported each other. And I was able to start focusing on the future rather than sort of dwelling on the past. I'm not going to lie, acceptance is not always easy. And I've often found myself sort of like thinking about the job that I could have been doing. And in these moments, I've tried to focus on gratitude. I'm so grateful to have an amazing wife and daughter, a loving, supporting family, and so many amazing friends. So I guess for me, in summary, acceptance has helped me move forward, and gratitude has allowed me to sort of focus on the many amazing positives in my fantastic life.
Thanks so much, Andy. Thank you for sharing that so beautifully. I know you've spoken about acceptance and gratitude. Elke, I'm really keen to know from your perspective, what else is there? Like, why are you so passionate about helping people with this kind of stuff, and what's your experience of resilience being?
It's fascinating speaking after somebody that, spent a great deal of their career dealing with dead bodies, and somebody that's had a massive accident. And actually, my career, of course, has been working with senior leaders across pretty much every sector. And I'm sitting here trying to reflect and go, oh, well, is one worse than the other and all the rest of it? Actually, interestingly, I think my passion comes from the trauma I see people live in on a daily basis because they don't understand their well-being and how to be resilient. So, you know, we deal with people, we meet people who on the outside have ticked so many boxes. You know, they've got the job, they've got the career, they probably look great, you know, they're fit, they've got the friends, they've got the cars and all the rest of it, and are living on a daily basis in a way that isn't joyful or easeful or right for them. So my passion, I guess, comes from, I believe there's a better way. I believe that I know for a fact there's a better way to live. And I believe this understanding about acceptance, understanding that life is a series of events, most of which we have absolutely no control over, and how we choose to respond to them will be what affects how we experience our lives. So I suppose my passion comes in a way from a much more mundane area of life, but also a far broader spreading, you know, life where people are living this way all over the world, actually. I guess what I've learned, and I was really interested to hear, can tell this isn't a rehearsed event, actually, so really interested to hear Neil's piece around the differences between robust and vulnerable resilience, because my words were the difference between forced resilience and true resilience, and I think they're very reflective of each other. For me, of course, forced resilience, which I believe is what is taught in most development programs, is tips and techniques about how to stay resilient. So, you know, the power of positive thinking and all of this sort of forceful stuff. Whereas true resilience comes from a far deeper understanding of how thought works in relation to events, how that we have the choice on a daily basis about how we experience what is happening around us, as opposed to allowing what happens around us to affect our experience of life. So I'm very interested to see that Neil and I come at it, and actually Andy as well, acceptance, you know, radical acceptance of what has gone on, and then choosing how we respond to it is what drives the resilience muscle, I think. I don't know if I can't remember the question, but I hope that.
Yeah, that's perfect. What I'm
perfect answer to the question.
Well, what I'd love, I know you spoke about the idea of trauma, and Elka's talked about that being tested a lot. In the police, people obviously face incredible trauma, and it's something we all face, but I'm really keen to know if there's anything we can learn from how the police support people in dealing with the trauma.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess I'm coming at this, we're talking a lot about trauma here, and I'm about to share a statistic around trauma in the police. And yes, it is relevant to the police and it's relevant to trauma, but let's not lose sight of actually these mechanisms and these insights that we're sharing are relevant to everything. So specifically looking at police officers, they say that over a lifetime, most people will be subjected to between 3 or 4 really traumatic incidents in their lifetime. And we'll all have different takes on what those things are. You know, I might think something that's not, Laura might think something that is, so that we've got to bear that in mind. For a police officer who does a 30-year service, they'll be exposed to anywhere between 300 and 400 traumas throughout their policing career, which actually has a massive, it absolutely has a huge impact on well-being. And the police do a great job at supporting that, but like any organization, there's more to be done. So my key takeaways from my experience in the time that I was in, there were a few things that really helped me. And the first one, interesting, the first reflection I had was around me helping myself, interestingly, and how the police had set up in a way, or the police set up in a way to really support that. And let me share an example of how that practically played out for me. And it's to do with something called the National Decision Model. Now, in the emergency services across the UK, there's a decision-making model that everybody's familiar with. And it's a process that you go through when you're making decisions, when you're under stress, or you are dealing with ambiguity, where you just don't know what's going to happen. And knowing that model really served me well in terms of when I came away from something, really sitting down, sometimes on my own, sometimes with others, and digesting what I just experienced using that model. And there was an amazing example once it was the sergeant I mentioned earlier, actually. of using this tool to help me individually. And she sat down with him one day and she said, Neil, again, that thing you've just been to, let's use the model and go through it, and let's just talk through it. And actually, when we get to the information side of things, tell me what you had, what information did you have at the time? And she used it to debrief the model. And at the end of that conversation, I just felt liberated. I felt like I'd shared. I felt like, oh, there's a lot of learning for me here. And more importantly, I'd done stuff really well. There's of course going to be lots of things I could have done better, but I'd done lots of stuff really well. So it's really useful to remind me, a useful tool to remind me of the stuff that I'd done well. The second thing that the police did really, really well was they had a process in place for officers who were exposed to trauma, and it was called the TRIM process. And if you were exposed to something, the minute you got back to the station, you'd have an appointment booked in to sit down with a practitioner who would talk you through what's happened. And they would raise concerns if anything you were saying or any insights that you were sharing warranted perhaps a referral to an expert in mental health. And I really felt held in that process. And I went through it a number of times, a few things that I had experienced. So there was the self-help piece there around the national decision model, being able to debrief myself and with other people, but also the referral process internally, which I think played a huge part in my personal well-being.
Thanks, Neil. I think you raised a good point at the start. We're talking there specifically about trauma, but I think you can substitute trauma in with the word challenge. Any challenge that anyone's facing, we can take inspiration from the police approach in that debriefing and allowing people to be held and feel supported. What I'm really conscious of, Elka, is that we will have a lot of kind of HRDs, L&D professionals here, and probably the big question for them is around how organizations can support individuals to develop their resilience. So what do you have to share around that?
Thank you. I think the place I'd start is there's quite a lot of myths around resilience. They say, oh, she's very resilient, she's not very resilient. It almost feels like if she's got blue eyes, she's got brown eyes, or whatever it is. And the truth is that human beings, as Neil pointed out, are born resilient. Like we have innate resilience, we have innate well-being. It exists within us. It's pre-programmed, and it's a skill that then can be developed. And it's about engaging that conscious choice of how do I develop that resilience muscle. And herein lies the problem: is most of the training around this is not very good, basically, because it deals at what I would call level 1 tips and techniques. You're feeling rubbish, so how do you deal with it? As opposed to, why are you feeling rubbish? How does your thinking work to make that a reality? So the first thing I think from an organizational point of view is really having the courage to decide whether or not you want to go deeper on this. You actually want to teach people, to use a biblical reference, which I'm not known for, my biblical references, but teach people to fish rather than to give them a fish and chip supper. So actually teaching them to fish. And if you're interested in that, then that is about teaching them how well-being works, that it is innate, how resilience works, that it is already within them, and that they are always making decisions that can build it up or, weaken it. So I would say from an organizational perspective, that's the first place I would start. To be specific about what that training might point to, I'd look at the nature of thought. So are you using it for you or against you? I'd look to what both Andy and Neil have spoken about, which is what I would call radical acceptance. It's an equation we use in Ivy House called E plus B equals R, which stands for event plus behavior equals result. So teaching people that how they respond to any events is a choice. I think they would also need to teach around internal narratives, personal narratives, organizational narratives. So I'll give you an example. I'm working with an organization right now, 250 of the most senior leaders across the global organization, and they have a whole corporate narrative around well-being, and it's not a good one. So they have a whole corporate narrative around, the workload is so bad, we're still in sort of a post-COVID crisis, we're not equipped, we don't have the resource. So they're never going to get out of that cultural narrative unless they elevate above it. So I would include internal narratives, personal narratives, and cultural narratives. I mentioned proactive well-being, so they would need to point to the innate nature of well-being. And I think the other thing is to encourage that I suppose, courageous learning, to use another Ivy House term, that reflection on what I can do in response to the event. So it's constantly learning, constantly evolving, and having this idea of building up the resilience muscle. And I think the core decision that corporate organizations have is whether or not they're prepared to actually go deep enough to create true change, or if they just want to manage the problem and keep it, ticking over where it is.
Thanks, Elka. There were lots of nods going on there. So,
well, I've also forgotten the question again. So if I didn't answer it, I've clearly got brain problems at the moment.
Around what organisations can do. So I think that was great. I know we'll circle back and probably dig into some bits a bit deeper. But Andy, we've not heard from you for a while, so I'm keen to know any of that as an individual who's had resilience tested. Does any of that ring true for you?
I suppose for me, it's more going back to what Neil was saying earlier, and time and time again, I've been surprised how people really struggle with something that appears trivial to me, but then cope brilliantly with something that I would find completely overwhelming. So I believe we should always remain curious and not make assumptions about how people will react in different situations. For me, it's about being a human leader, developing strong bonds with your team so they feel comfortable to share and to ask for help when needed. This also, it's not just about in organisations, this is in your personal life as well. So for me, just the simple act of asking a simple question, are you okay, when you think your friends are struggling, can be so powerful just to open the door. And I've found my friends sharing things that I can imagine them sharing with me, and they've been so grateful just to have someone to speak to and share their challenges.
That's really interesting, because I think there's possibly a view of resilience being tested being the same for everyone. And I know you've spoken about before, Andy, being really shocked by the things that have tested your resilience and other things you've been fine with, and possibly sometimes us having a bit of judgment that other people don't deal with things in the same way. So really, really interesting. I think there are a lot of other assumptions out there. Neil, we've touched on a few as we've gone through today. Are there any others that we should be challenging?
Yes, and I love this topic of assumptions. And I just want to go back to something Elka said a minute ago. Elka mentioned the nature of thought. And I think the one thing I want to say quickly is our perception on the world is very much shaped by our thinking. And therefore, we'll all make different assumptions about different groups of individuals or what it is that we're observing happening. But a couple key ones that really stand out for me that I really do think need challenging. Firstly, is perhaps an inward looking one. The fact that we quite often tell ourselves the narrative or the story, and this is exactly what it is. And I think this is really important to remember. It is just a story that you are telling yourself, that you are resilient or you're not. And it's a yes or no. And if you tell yourself no, then guess what? That thought will play out in your behavior. So when you show up for things, guess what? You're going to come across as though you're not resilient, because that's the story that you're telling yourself. So actually, let's challenge that. Be far better to recognize that you are resilient, more resilient in some things than you are in others. But also, to go back to what Elka was saying earlier, it's not an absolute. Just because you don't feel resilient in something doesn't mean you can't improve or you can't get better. I think this is really important. So if you are a leader in an organization, and actually that's the narrative that you want to be talking to your people with and helping them see the journey to building resilience. So that's the first one. And the second one for me, which I think is really relevant to today's workplace, is around generational stereotyping and making very quick assumptions on other generations. And let's pick Generation Z, for example. I've heard a lot of stories going around about how Generation Z are lazy. They don't want to do X, they don't want to do Y, therefore they are not resilient. Well, there's another story to that. Maybe the other story is, maybe they don't want to do things that way and they want to find a smarter way. And so actually their resilience is showing up in a very different way. Their resilience is showing up through creativity, saying no, pushing back on what it is that perhaps we're doing and the way that we're operating in order to seek a new way of doing things. So they would be my two main assumptions that I think we need to challenge.
Wow, I love that, Neil. I remember Elka saying to me recently, we treat evolution as if it was something that happened until the day we were born and then it stopped. And actually evolution is continuing to happen. So that idea that different generations are just more evolved is a really interesting view. Elka, I have a big assumption here, which is the one, whose job is it to support individuals with their resilience?
What's your assumption?
I think lots of people will think it is the individual's responsibility.
Yeah, so I think it's both. I think it's really easy to sit here and go, ultimately, you know, we can be a bit Anthony Robbins about this, can't we? And we go, it's all about you and your willpower and your strength and all the rest of it. But the problem is we have an education system, both schools and universities, that don't teach people about innate well-being. They do not teach people about resilience and having a choice over how they respond to events. They don't teach people how to use thought. So if we're going to create any organizational shift, any societal shift, then I believe strongly that schools need to play a part in this as well. But I really believe organizations need to play a part in this. And this goes back to, is it my job just to keep things ticking over and make sure there's counselors and therapists on hand when people need it? Or is it my job to create some change? So I think the responsibility sits in both places. So, but the organization's job, and is it okay if I focus on the organization for a moment? The organization's job is to put the right kind of development in place. And do you know what amazes me? And COVID comes up all the time with clients, which actually is really interesting to me, because COVID is a long time ago in my mind. But clients are like, that we're still running the COVID narrative and all the rest of it. What's fascinating is we were losing 19 million working days to stress, anxiety, and depression before COVID happened, right? People were disconnected with their leaders to the same extent as they are now. So we have this narrative that it's all happened because of the way we're changing and working and living, but actually that's not true. You know, there's a brilliant poet, and I've forgotten his name, of course, a British poet, that talks about, let's stop deluding ourselves. We weren't all skipping through the daisies with unicorns before the way we were living and working changed. So there needs, in my mind, to be a sort of waking up to, this is a real challenge. It's affecting the bottom line if we're going to get business around it. It's affecting mental well-being, which of course is the next crisis that's going to hit our country in a major way. And we're either going to do something proper about it or we're not. So that's the first key decision. I mean, apparently, and I'm going to read this stat because I found it just before we came online, UK organisations lost 28.3 billion per year, are losing 28.3 billion pounds a year because of people not being well for mental illness and all the rest of it, depression, stress, and anxiety. So, you know, if we want to just get really commercial about it, we need to sort it out. Sorting it out means going deeper. And the bottom line is traditional leadership development that focus on just the top line skills around performance and managing people is never going to get there. It's a choice organizations have got to make, I guess.
Thank you. I'm sure we're going to have more questions digging into that one on a deeper level, but we're going to move over to the Q&A now. I know we've had some questions submitted in advance of today, so I'm going to hand over to my very glamorous assistant, Bryony, for our first question.
Yeah, we had some brilliant questions submitted in advance. The first one that we're going to share is, what do you think are the biggest misconceptions regarding resilience and how that may affect people in the world of work? Now, Neil, I know you talked about challenging assumptions. I wonder what your take is on the misconceptions.
Yeah, I guess I'm going to focus on the latter part of that question, actually. How does it show up in the workplace? Because I think that's typically where we see it. I think the misconceptions around resilience I've kind of touched on already, that, you know, you are or you're not, or, you know, you have to play a part to be as well. That was one I touched on earlier. Where we see it show up in organizations is we see people withdraw. We see people unwilling to take risks. We see people lacking creativity. We see people leaving organizations. And actually, quite a few of these things already are probably some of your biggest challenges in your organization right now. So I do think there's a direct correlation, as Elke was speaking about earlier, about how we develop our individuals in our organization to prevent them leaving, so that they can be more creative, so that they have more confidence, etc., etc. And I've forgotten your question as well. I'm just off on a tangent just speaking about this, so I can completely relate to where you're coming from, Elke. But I think not showing people the right way to build resilience in that robust way shows up in some really detrimental ways in your organization that ultimately affects the bottom line. And it's the same issues that I hear people speaking about time and time again. And we quite often look for that silver bullet to fix these things. Well, that silver bullet doesn't exist. It's all about empowering individuals to look at themselves, really focus on their strengths, really understand how their brain works, how their body works, and helping them step into who they are. Once you can do that successfully, then quite a few of those issues that I've just spoken around really do start to resolve themselves.
Right, thank you, Neil. And it was about misconceptions, so I think you answered that brilliantly.
Wonderful, good news.
The next question is quite specific. What would you advise for someone who feels like their backs are against the wall and it feels like you're running out of options? It can be hard to keep going, even though you know all the tricks and tools to work on mindset, etc., but nothing seems to work. Elka, I feel like you'd have a great answer on this.
Oh, but even that question makes my heart go out to whoever asked it. So if you're listening to this, my heart goes out to you, because I really understand that feeling of there being nowhere to go. So this is an individual. Can you hear a dog barking in the background? No, good. Okay, this is an individual question. So I'm going to speak to the individual. The first thing you need to remember when you're feeling that you've tried everything is probably that your resources are running low. So the first point of being resilient is that physical, mental, spiritual wellness is to just feel okay and safe within yourself. So my top piece of advice would be, first, stop trying to figure anything out. Go and get some rest, get some peace in your mind, get out of your mind, not on drugs, get out of your mind, get out of your thinking, meditate, walk in nature, allow that thinking to settle, because you will not solve the problem in your mind. That's a given, you won't. So the first thing is find peace, find space, allow yourself to breathe, and try and do everything you can to rest that thinking down. Many different ways to do that, but meditation is often the easiest. And even if you think you can't meditate, just take some time to breathe and let that go. So that's the first thing. Then the second thing is to remember that life is a series of events, and most of those events you have no control over. But what you have control over is how you choose to respond to those events. So it might be that you've tried everything you can do to, communicate with a boss that just isn't listening to you, or to tell them the trouble you're in or whatever it is, and it's not working. So radical acceptance, they're not listening, it's not happening. I still have a choice how I respond. Do I go and work somewhere else? Do I have a conversation with somebody else? Do I write them a letter? Whatever it might be. So it's that understanding that we always have a choice over our behavior. We usually don't have a choice over the event. Does that make sense? And then the third thing is about getting some separation for yourself so that you can actually see the events over there and recognize that no matter what is going on over there, you're still okay. You're always okay. Always, always okay. So as long as you can create that separation and come back to it with some strength, with some peace, it'll all be all right in the end. Bad stuff happens. Hope that helps.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, I was completely taken in on that, because I know I've felt similar situations, so that was really useful for me as well. Thank you. And then the last question I absolutely love, which is, how did you get through the hardest time in your life? And I'd actually love to put that to all of the speakers. Andy, I wonder if you'd be happy to take the first on that.
Yeah, I was enjoying listening to that as well. I've actually talked about one of my challenges already, so I'm going to talk about another challenging time in my life. And it was just over 10 years ago. My daughter was born on a Friday and in Guildford, and then on the Saturday and Sunday, I was actually in trials for the GB cycling team in Wales, and then I came back from Wales, and then a few days later, my brother died of a brain tumour. So it was one hell of a week. And I guess the way I coped was there was so much going on. I just had to focus on one thing at a time, keep making small steps and just keep moving forward.
Wow. Thank you, Andy. Neil, what got you through the hardest time in your life?
Big, isn't it? I actually think one of the hardest times of my life was in my early days being a police officer, if I'm being brutally honest. I thought I was this indestructible policeman who could come in, rescue everybody and not be affected by anything. However, I very quickly realized I was only human, and absolutely I was feeling all kinds of things, and it was exhausting. It was exhausting playing a part. And to go back to the story I shared with you earlier, when that one sergeant sat me down one day and said, you know, that's not normal, Neil, and showed me a human side to her as a leader, it made a complete game-changing difference for me. From that moment on, I was able to share with other people. I was confident enough to share with other people in my team. And it was almost like a pressure valve being released. Had that one individual not said those few words to me, I think it could have been a very different story for me throughout my career, and I would have bottled a huge amount up, and who knows what place I'll be in now. So it was that human leadership piece which I saw, which made the biggest difference.
It's really interesting. Thank you, Neil. Elka, same question. Oh, you're on mute.
I'm running through all different kinds of events in my head thinking, which was worse? Was that worse or was that worse? I'm going to choose when I left my husband. I'd left my job, I'd left my company to try and make my marriage work because I was working so hard. I wasn't around much enough at home. So I'd left my company to make my marriage work. And I realized in that period that it wasn't going to work. And I'd always been the main breadwinner. So when I left without any kind of financial, I had no job, and I left without any kind of financial support. I had 2 kids, 2 support, and I was on my own. And the thing that got me through, and if I'm honest, this is such a major part in the work we do here at Ivy House, because the thing that got me through was truly understanding that the quality of my thinking was determining the experience of my life on a minute-by-minute basis. And if I got a moment to give an example.
Yeah.
Yes. So I might have given this example on an event before, so I hope my ex-husband isn't listening, but we had not a bad divorce. We had a good divorce. We were co-parenting and we'd supported each other through the parenting piece until he met a lady who didn't want him to co-parent with me. And all of a sudden our sort of contract, our human contract around bringing up our children changed. And the rage I felt on behalf of my very young children, I'm filling up now, was huge. And I realized that it would be so easy for me at that point to become a victim, to become a very angry ex-wife, to become a really bitter mother and drive a story, a narrative for my kids about how bad their father was and how evil their stepmother was and all the rest of it. And in that moment of darkness, and I got to tell you, I did go down that spiral at times, I always remembered I had a choice. I always remembered I had a choice to spend so much time with that thinking. So my resilience came into play to literally, I was like a drug addict pulling myself out of the negative thinking that was making my experience of life so rubbish. And I think that was me being my most resilient against myself. Does that make sense? I don't mean against myself, but it wasn't against the world. It was against this thinking is so addictive, because victim is really addictive, right? When the world is being done to me, it's so addictive because I feel vindicated because everyone else is evil and bad. So actually I was battling against that almost addictive nature of that thought to pull myself into a place of it's not serving me or my children or my ex-husband or his new wife. Does that, yeah, so that was, I don't know, I've forgotten the question, but that was my experience, I guess, of me being the most resilient. And now obviously I'm caring for a very sick and actually dying father. It's remembering that I don't have to spend time in thought that doesn't serve me. That doesn't mean I don't feel sadness or grief. but it means that I can still be powerful and take ownership in that moment.
Thank you, Elke. Thank you all of you for some really personal shares there.
Wow. Thank you. So those, I believe, were all the questions we had submitted in advance. If anyone does have any questions that they'd like to type in the chat, or indeed, if you'd like to come up and ask the question of a speaker, I think if you raise your hand, we can bring you up on stage, so to speak. If there are no questions, I think I'll give you a chance whilst I ask this final one. It would be really nice to have some kind of top tips, summaries for people to take away, because we've talked about a lot today. So Neil, I'd love to know from you kind of 3 key takeaways from a personal perspective on what people can do to support their own resilience.
Yeah, sure. What would they be? 3. The first one relates back to what I was talking about earlier. So it's about identifying what your next step is that's going to take you towards what it is you're trying to achieve, and just be really micro with that. What is that one step? It could be to get up from your desk right now and go and sit in the garden for 5 minutes. Don't underestimate the value of those tiny little 1% in making you more resilient. That's the first thing. The second thing is be really curious and incredibly courageous to really get to know yourself. And it's not just knowing yourself in terms of, hi, I'm Neil, I'm good at this, I'm not very good at that. What sits beneath that? What's going on for you? And actually remember, your perspective is only going to get you so far in uncovering your true self. You're going to have to speak to other people. You're going to have to get feedback. The moment you start to do that, you start to go on a journey of self-discovery, and it is completely life-changing. So that's the second thing. The third thing for me is around relationships. Elke spoke about the mental health crisis that we've got around the globe right now. I think it was Simon Sinek said the other day that he firmly believes that a big contributor towards that is the fact, as human beings, we're not very good at forming relationships, deep, meaningful relationships. So a big takeaway would be to review your relationships, review your circle. Who are you surrounding yourself with? And ask yourself the question, what is it I want to get out of that relationship? And also, what am I putting into that relationship? Is it serving me? Is it serving the other person? And if not, maybe review that and look at where you're spending your time. So my top 3 things to be more resilient would be those.
Thank you so much, Neil. And Elke, I'd love to end from, I guess, with your perspective on the top tips that an organisation can do if they are keen to create a culture of resilience.
So I'm going to build on what Neil's just said, actually, from an organisational perspective. One of the things we talk to at Ivy House is operating from core strength. And what that means is knowing how you thrive, like what kind of environment, job, what kind of work makes you, thrive and be strong, because ultimately resilience is strength, isn't it? So I would say from an organizational perspective, the first thing I would focus on is enabling people to find that place in your organization that makes resilience easy. So I used to have Laura's job until she chucked me out. But when I had Laura's job, I was in a job that I was thriving in a sense that it was the right place for me to be, and it made resilience come far easier. And I think if organizations can help people to find their place in the world, to find their place in organizations, that's an easier place to start from. The next thing I would look at is something Andy said, which is developing your people to be human leaders. Actually, and this isn't about, just to be really clear, I think it's important we say this isn't about everyone being vulnerable, super vulnerable all over the place, right? I sometimes call that emotional sneezing. That's not the thing that builds resilience. Builds resilience is having people that you can go and talk to in the right process, the right structure, the right framework, that are trained to be able to support you and have somewhere to help you. So we need to enable our leaders to facilitate that kind of environment. And then the third thing, and I'm going to ask Neil to give this example because you haven't given this example, you've told me about it in the past, Neil, is having frameworks and structures around your business that support the development and growth of resilience, recognizing that it is a learning, like we can get better at it. So it's not a failure if you're not it, it's how do you take that learning and step up to the next level and the next level. So we need to build our processes and frameworks. I think Neil didn't mention this example because it came from the fire service and not the police service. But can you, have we got time, Neil? This is a great example, guys. You need to stay on and listen to this example, because this is an example of a perfect framework that builds learning and resilience as it goes.
Yeah, if there are any police officers watching this, it didn't come from me, right? So this is a great example of how to really support people to be courageous learners in order to help them be resilient, to take them to the next level, as Elka has just said. And again, it was in one of my early days in policing, and I went to deal with a car crash, and the fire brigade arrived, and they did everything that they needed to do, and they were incredible. To observe them do their thing was remarkable. And then I was waiting to go to the next incident, so I was quite keen at this point to open the road to get it all cleared up so that I could go on to my next incident to be dealt with. And to my initial frustration, what happened was the fire brigade created like a semicircle in the middle of this road that I was desperate to open. And the leader of the crew, whoever it was, went through everybody individually using the national decision model that I shared with you earlier, and said, okay, so Elka, tell me about what information you had when you first arrived. Talk me through what actions you took. Right, Andy, you tell me. And then collectively, they all had their say. And I was completely drawn into this to the point where I joined the end of the queue because I wanted to have a say as well. So they actually came to me and I was able to contribute something. And it was just a moment of magic, because in that moment, there was one particular thing that collectively as a team, they identified that they need to improve on next time. They documented it, and I know that they would have gone away and practiced it as they do so well on the Tuesday night drill night whenever they were going to go and do it. So don't underestimate the time of stopping and pausing amongst the chaos, amongst the pace of life, amongst the pace of business, and having a framework in place that works for you and individuals in an organization, and just being with it for a moment and having that conversation, because the benefits are absolutely huge.
Brilliant example.
Amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you both. Thank you to all of our speakers. I have been here writing notes as I've gone through, which is the first time I've been like fully engrossed in an event. So thank you for all of your really vulnerable shares. I think it's made for a really interesting conversation. Thank you to everyone for joining today. Thanks to those who have their cameras on. It's lovely to see you. I'll let you know about two things. We're going to drop a link to some feedback in the chat. I would be really grateful if you could take 2 minutes just to fill that in. But I'd also love to let you know about our next event, which is running on the 30th of May. And it's called Getting Practical, How to Actually Accelerate the Careers of Your Minority Groups. And we have an insane panel of speakers, actually. We're joined by Sangeeta Clark, who is Global Head of Diversity at Bloomberg. Janet Tidmarsh, who's head of DE&I at Whitbread, and Ralph McBaden, who founded a charity called Open Palm, who are all about racial equality. And it is set to be an incredible conversation, naming lots of things that we're doing brilliantly and things that we're not doing so well. So it could be an interesting debate, and we will open up as ever for a Q&A at the end. So I'd love to see you all there. We'll drop a note to you in your inboxes to give you the links to register. But thank you for your time. It has been really lovely to spend this afternoon with you. That's it from me.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.